guest tonight is James Perloff. James is the author of Truth is a Lonely Warrior, Unmasking the Forces Behind Global Destruction, and Shadows of Power, an expose on the Council of Foreign Relations. James was also the screenwriter for Shadow Ring, the latest documentary done by Freemind Films, correct?
That is correct, and that is actually comes out of the first 6 chapters of Truth is a Lonely Warrior. It's an intro to the New World Order in video format.
Okay. And tonight, of course, we're going to talk about the Council on Foreign Relations, its origins, and the important role it played in the 20th century, and perhaps its key role in building what, for lack of a better word, their term is the New World Order. The Council on Foreign Relations. So, what is that all about?
Well, the Council is an organization that is, since its inception, devoted to steering American foreign policy towards acceptance of world government. And it's also been the almost monolithic recruiting ground for the American government for cabinet-level positions, which is the reason why we only see cosmetic changes when we go from a Democrat to a Republican. So in the White House, I should probably talk a little about the Council's origins. The Council was founded in 1921, and it came into being as a direct result of what had occurred at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. That conference was settling the aftermath of the First World War, and Woodrow Wilson came to that conference with his famous 14 points in hand, and point 14 was a League of Nations. Now, this was a long-term goal of the Illuminati and the cabal of bankers that runs our world, the Zionist bankers, was to have a single government ruling the world. And that's even something that the Bible prophesies. But the League of Nations was the first formal attempt at that, and it was successfully implemented. However, due to the fact that there's a stipulation in the United States Constitution that the president cannot single-handedly make a treaty, it has to be ratified by the Senate. America did not join the League of Nations. The Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty that said, our boys have paid enough sacrificing their lives on the European front for $30 a month, and we don't think that we have to see any reason why America over here should give up its national sovereignty to some international body. So the League of Nations was rejected, and as a result of that, the bankers who had accompanied Wilson to Paris and dictated everything he did there held a series of meetings, and finally at a dinner at the Majestic Hotel on May the 30th, 1919, they resolved to form a new organization that would change America's mind about world government. And that was incorporated 2 years later as the Council on Foreign Relations. And it's, just to give you a taste of it, it has a journal that's it started in 1922. It's still in print, called Foreign Affairs. And the very first issue in 1922 had an article called The Next American Contribution to Civilization. And what's that? I'll quote the article. Quote, "Our government should enter heartily into the existing League of Nations, take a sympathetic share in every discussion broached in the League, and be ready to take more than its share in all the responsibilities which unanimous action of the nations constituting the League might impose," unquote. And you can go from there. I'll just give you one more. From the second issue of Foreign Affairs in 1922, we have Philip Carr declaring, quote, "Obviously there is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind as long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government," unquote. So that's their starting point. It is still their goal today. And as we'll see in the course of tonight, they decided that you can't impose world government from the top down. You've got to do it piece by piece, which is why we have things like the EU and NAFTA. But that was how they came into being, and they are, the most influential organization that there is in America as far as formulating foreign policy goes.
Now, the Council of Foreign Relations, it was created 1921, 1922?
21.
Now, this also coincided with the creation of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in the United Kingdom, which developed out of the Rhodes Circle, right?
That's correct. And this was brought to light by Carroll Quigley in his book, Tragedy and Hope. And Rhodes was, Cecil Rhodes was, of course, a diamond and mining magnate, and pretty amazing to have a country named after you, Rhodesia, right? But when he died, he was not married, and he didn't have any heirs, and he actually left a large part of his fortune to the Rothschilds, as if they needed it, right? And
you guess may suspect what his role was in that, yeah.
Well, they'd been working together, of course,
yeah.
And he had this vision that he always talked about of uniting the English-speaking world. And Tim, as I've looked back on that, I think that was simply a regional step towards world government. Unite the English-speaking countries first, and eventually we'll bring in the non-English-speaking countries later. But his inheritance, his will not only created the Rhodes Scholarships, but they created this trust that Lord Alfred Milner, high-ranking Freemason, and Lord Rothschild were in charge of dispersing, and they created what they called the Round Table groups. And just to quote Quigley, he said, quote, "The Round Table groups were semi-secret discussion and lobbying groups organized by Lionel Curtis, Philip Carr, who I just quoted, and William Morris in 1908 to 11. This was done on behalf of Lord Milner, the dominant trustee of the Rhodes Trust, in the decades 1905 to 1925. The original purpose of these groups was to seek to federate the English-speaking world along lines laid down by Cecil Rhodes." And then this to tie in the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute. I'm just moving a little further ahead in his book. He says, quote, "At the end of the War of 1914, it became clear that the organization of this system had to be greatly extended. The front organization, called the Royal Institute of International Affairs, had as its nucleus in each area, meaning each part of the English-speaking world, the existing submerged Round Table group in New York. It was known as the Council on Foreign Relations. It was a front for J.P. Morgan and Company in association with a very small American Round Table group." And he does mention some of the members of this American Round Table group, people like the journalist Walter Lippmann and Thomas Lamont, who was a partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. And as he also said there, it was a front company for J.P. Morgan and Company. Well, if you take a look at the original leadership of the Council on Foreign Relations back in 1922, the founding president was John W. Davis, who was J.P. Morgan's personal attorney, and the founding vice president was Paul Cravath, who was also a Morgan attorney, and the founding chairman was Russell Leffingwell, who was a partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. So it's definitely a Morgan operation. But just kind of interesting. I was just looking at, before tonight's show, I was looking through their current annual report. And if you look at the current co-chairs, you have Carla Hills, who's on the board of J.P. Morgan Chase. And, of course, J.P. Morgan eventually combined with Chase Manhattan, which was the Rockefeller Bank. And, of course, David Rockefeller, who's still the honorary chairman of the council, was the official chairman from 70 to 85, and his predecessor was John J. McCloy, who was chairman of Chase Manhattan. But you see this connectivity between J.P. Morgan in 1921 and J.P. Morgan today. It's still the bankers running the show there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find this interesting description of the CFR in an article titled, this is in the mid-90s, "The Council on Foreign Relations, the New World Order." And this dates the December of 1995. And he said, the CFR is the promotional arm of the ruling elite in the United States of America. Most influential politicians, academics, and media personalities are members, and it uses its influence to infiltrate the New World Order into American life. Its experts write scholarly pieces to be used in decision-making. The academic expound on the wisdom of a united world, and the media members disseminate the message. Mm-hmm. And that's how it works. And it appears to be sort of a heterodox opinion, but it really is. It's coming. These ideas are produced, and then they're kind of spread out throughout the media, through academia, and it gives the impression of sort of a again like a diverse opinion, but it really is coming from one source.
You're absolutely right, and it obviously was very important to influence public opinion both through the colleges and universities and through the mainstream, mass media. And Quigley, I don't have the quote in front of me, but he commented on the fact that, it was obviously looked very strange to have a Foreign Affairs Association that just consisted of bankers and lawyers working for the Rockefellers and Morgans. So they quickly brought in college professors, but as Quigley pointed out, these all came from colleges and universities that were getting big endowments from J.P. Morgan. So they were people they could count on to come to the council and be indoctrinated in world government and then return to their universities and spread these ideas, just as you were saying. And as a matter of fact, to quote from the 2015 annual report, it says, it's describing the different initiatives. It says, quote, the academic outreach connects students with CFR research and programming, provides professors with teaching tools to facilitate a deeper understanding of international issues in their classrooms, unquote. So that's still going on today. And in terms of the media, one reason why we have this false consensus, appearance of consensus in the mainstream media, and why nobody ever questions the war on terror or questions the official narrative of 9/11. Of course, you know that there's 6 corporations that own over 90% of our media. But I talked in one of the chapters of my book, The Shadows of Power, which is actually published in 1988. It's been almost 30 years. I had a chapter on the media contacts back then. But just to look at some of the nexus with the CFR and the media, if you look today at Fox, Rupert Murdoch is CFR, and the chairman and CEO of Fox News is Roger Ailes, who's CFR. And if you go to a Time Warner, where you've got CNN, you've got Jeffrey Bewkes is the president of Time Warner. He's CFR. And look at their news anchors like that they've had, like Judy Woodruff and Paul Luzon and Aaron Burnett, Peter Bergen, all CFR. And if you move over to Time Magazine, which is now in part of Time Warner, Henry Luce, the founder, was CFR, and Hedley Donovan, who was the longtime editor, was CFR. And I don't want to bore people with a lot of names, but just go to CBS, the founder, William Paley, was CFR, and major anchors like Dan Rather. And you go to NBC, its founder, Robert Sarnoff, was CFR, and Tom Brokaw, and today Brian Williams are CFR. And they go to the New York Times, the Sulzbergers, who owned it, were CFR, and Leslie Gelb actually is the president emeritus today. Same thing with ABC, Washington Post, Eugene Meyer, who took it over in 1933 with CFR, and McNeil Lair of PBS CFR. So, you've got their hooks all over the media. And so since they are indoctrinated in the council's viewpoint, of course they're going to spread it, and the public is going to get this fake impression that there's a consensus when actually that consensus is emanating from one source.
And what they do is they'll produce policy papers or disseminate memes or ideas throughout the media that appear to be representing the broad interest of, say, the United States. Call it national security or economic policy, but it really represents the narrow interest of a few corporations.
That is correct. That is correct.
Like what's good for GM is good for America, the old, as Charles Wilson said back in the 50s, and that's the attitude, this corporatist mentality. But that's, again, what we're looking at is, what we see here is the actual method by which the ruling elite maintain their dominance. I think it was Carol Quigley who wrote about this dominance. He said about investment bankers, and said nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in the private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole, controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. Now, of course, we can see how it's done through the CFR, through the Royal Institute of International Affairs, through the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, or the Australian Institute of International Affairs, or whatever, because they have the different branches throughout the world. They kind of, and they all meet. Of course, we have examples. We have Davos, the World Economic Forum, with the power elite rub elbows. Of course, there's Bilderberg, which for decades we were told was didn't exist, or just something that was dreamt up in the minds of crazy conspiracy theorists. Now it's widely covered and admitted, and other things. Well, we have the Bohemian Grove meeting, the annual soiree that occurs every year out in California, where the power elite get together and have fun, and our concerns about what's going on there are supposed to be allayed by the message that reads entry into the meeting. Weaving spiders come not here. I guess that's supposed to suggest that nothing of anything of importance is ever done there. No important decisions are ever taken there. But that's, I think, a bit naive. I mean, I was reading an article about Bohemian Grove, and the focus of the article was that it's just a party. Nothing important ever happens there. But the photograph that accompanied the article, I guess, was from the late 60s, perhaps around 1967, 68. And the photograph had Richard Nixon sitting at a table with Ronald Reagan, the then governor of California, getting together all these business elite. And, again, it's hard to believe that policy decisions aren't being taken there in such a gathering. You have two future presidents of the United States meeting with the business elite. If you want to believe that it's not important, fine. You go ahead and believe that. But I'm skeptical of such a claim.
That's right. There's ways to have fun besides draping yourselves in these hoods before a 40-foot owl and conducting a mock human sacrifice, and ways to have fun that don't require congregating together as this body. So I would have to say that yes, there's definitely significant discussions, even though we don't get to know what they are, that are taking place about who's going to be taking over the Fed and who's going to be the next president and vice president and things of that nature. I'm sure are on their lips, and when you have people who are with that kind of power being wielded, I'm sure that they're not just there to play games of darts and stuff.
Yeah. But again, you talk about media, the control of the media, which is key to this. Of course, we're talking about the CFR's control of the media and how all the major networks and publication firms belong to it, or at least their editors, the people of importance of those organizations, belong to the Council on Foreign Relations. But the press itself has always been controlled by powers that be in this country. I mean, even the Pulitzer Prize is named after Joseph Pulitzer, who was a leader of what was called yellow journalism. Mm-hmm. And so the prizes,
very appropriate.
The prizes that our journalist members of the Fourth Estate covet is a prize named after a ardent or a out of the closet yellow journalist, right? I mean, so we won't be too surprised that news media is going to be biased or manipulated in some way to serve a larger political end or a geopolitical end there.
Yeah, it is interesting that he named it after Pulitzer because he was a propagandist. He was a big propagandist for the Spanish-American War, which my last show with Corbett was on. We talked more about William Randolph Hearst, but I think that the reason they probably didn't call it the Hearst Prize, I don't really know the history of it, but Hearst eventually kind of turned on him a little bit. He actually went against going into World War I, and I think that's he fell a little out of favor, and that's probably why they were able to make the Orson Welles depiction of him that was unflattering.
That's right.
Yeah. Which is usually they won't do their own unless you've done something that irritates them. So I guess they gave it the Pulitzer Prize to number 2 in the propaganda yellow journalism, which was Joseph Pulitzer in his New York World.
Mm-hmm. And of course, with the media, we had Frank Wisner as a mighty Wurlitzer. He said he could play America like an organ, which used the media, and he was good friends with Philip Graham of the Washington Post. And it's come out now that the Ben Bradley, the crusading editor-in-chief of the Washington Post during the Watergate era, was tied to the agency when he worked in Europe, posting propaganda pieces and getting intel. And what's strange enough that is, one thing you mentioned, William Perley, because he was CBS and he came from the OSS, and Sarnoff had to see the OSS and OWI during the war. So a lot of the people who went into media in the dawn of modern media after World War II emerged from the psychological warfare offices of the United States government during World War II. So it's not too surprising that our media would be, the sources of our information, whether it's print or electronic, would be manipulated by greater powers, because that's what it's founded on. Of course, then we have Operation Mockingbird, right? Which
Oh, yes, that was brought up by the Church Committee,
Yeah.
and you're quite right, too, about the Office of War Information. They would have honed their propaganda skills and honed them very well, the stereotypical films about the Japanese, our enemy, and so forth, and those could now be, they've been making up atrocity stories for years now. That goes back to the yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst when he claimed that in Spain, in Cuba, that the Spanish were roasting Cuban priests and were throwing the Cubans to sharks. And, of course, that was all made up, like the baby incubator stories. They got us into the Gulf War, but they wanted to get us into the Spanish-American War for multiple reasons, but probably very close to the top of the list was to get control of the Cuban sugar industry. As Mark Twain later said, it was all about the price of sugar. But atrocity stories, manipulation of public opinion, that is what the media is really about, is control.
And even before, going back even further, we're going back before World War I. Of course, we mentioned Pulitzer and Hearst and all that, but the Wall Street interest. In 1914, there was a speech on the Senate floor by Senator Callaway that talked about how J.P. Morgan interest had had bought up 25 of America's leading newspapers to promote America's entry into the war, which was raging at that time, the First World War, the Great War. And this is another example how these interests would buy up these newspapers, these corporate interests. And, of course, that's what we have today, right?
Well, I could actually quote Callaway right now. Here's what he said. It's actually 1917. This is straight out of the Congressional Record. Here's what he said, quote, in March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interest, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interest, that would be DuPont, and their subsidiaries got together 12 men high in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. They worked the problem out by selecting 179 newspapers and then began by an elimination process to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of the daily press throughout the country. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of the 25 greatest papers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase a policy, national and international, of these papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought to be paid for by the month. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interest of the purchasers. This policy also included the suppression of everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served, unquote. And so that's 1917, and this is a hot topic for some congressmen because they were trying to keep us out of the war in 1917. That was when we declared war, and I'm sure that Callaway was in that minority that were against it. Along with people like Bob La Follette, who exposed the whole Lusitania affair and was threatened with impeachment until Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who'd resigned over the pro-war policy, came forward and confirmed what he said about the Lusitania. But you can move it ahead to 1937. Ferdinand Lundberg wrote a magnificent book called America's 60 Families, and I went for a long time without reading that, and I was so glad that I finally got caught up with it. It's out of print. I had to get an old library copy, but he's got a full chapter on there, Tim, on media control, which in 1930s mostly consisted of the newspapers. There's no internet and no TV. But he went from coast to coast, and he showed that virtually every major newspaper or newspaper chain was owned by America 60 or somebody was fronting for them. And there are very few exceptions. I think he said that the Howard Scripps chain was one chain that they hadn't got their hands on yet, but they basically had America's media locked up in 1937. Of course, that was another ideal time to be owning all the media because they were about to get us into another war.
Mm-hmm. And that's why his Father Coughlin got kicked off the radio, too, at the time.
I haven't heard the story of how he got kicked off radio, but I sure enjoy listening to or reading the transcripts of some of the, he was like Benjamin Friedman. He was one of those few guys out there that you could actually turn to and hear what was really going on in America because he wasn't owned. Yeah.
And back then, America still had some diversity. He had that sort of that Midwestern conservative opposition to the Eastern Seaboard. And then, of course, that was illustrated or manifested best in the American First Committee, which became slandered, as being pro-Nazi because they weren't active supporters of America's entry into the war. Of course, they did after Pearl Harbor. They fell into line like everyone else, which is one of the reasons why that operation was pulled off, to get everyone marching off the war. You also back then you also had regional business interests that supported. They reflected the values of their region, whether it was the Michigan or Midwest, and they were very opposed to FDR's drive to war, and they formed the financial support for the American First Committee. I think the owners of the Sears Roebuck Company or General Wood, and these guys were big funders for the American First Committee. Of course, now that would be impossible because now we live in such a globalized economy that there's no such thing as a localized business that has a loyalty to a region or a region of the country. That wasn't so much the case in the 1930s. We still had these regional businesses.
You're right. Part of the consolidation process is political. So the EU is an example of political consolidation. The common market and NAFTA are examples of economic consolidation, but they also have, of course, these business mergers, and you have, your corporations moving in, your Walmarts, and
you mentioned that in Truth is a Lonely Warrior.
Yeah.
I think it's chapter 10.
I forget which chapter it's in, but the fact that the mom and pop businesses and the smaller local businesses are either put out of business by the big corporate interests or they get bought out. There's even been concern within the organic food industry that more and more suppliers of organic foods are being bought out by the big multinationals because they can come forward with millions of dollars and offer more than the company's worth, and few people will resist that on grounds of principle alone. Many people will give in, and then of course they've got their hands on the food industry. So there's a consolidation process, even extends into religion, which is what ecumenicism is, one world religion. But you're right, they took that out. But just to get back to America First for a moment, there's a famous quote from Admiral Chester Ward, who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. They made a mistake when they let him in. He was former Judge Advocate of the U.S. Navy. He resigned in disgust, but here's what he said. He said that the Council objective is, quote, submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. In the entire CFR lexicon, there is no term of revulsion carrying a meaning so deep as America First, unquote. Admiral Ward, and of course he is Admiral Ward is referring to to the America First Committee of Charles Lindbergh and General Wood, and that is something that really ticked off these New World Order guys. They did not want nationalism. They degraded that as isolationism, and isolationists, to use their term, were not against international communications, but they simply wanted us to retain our sovereignty and to follow the principles of America's founding fathers and not become entangled in foreign wars.
Yes, because you lose control of your own nation when that happens. Of course, we see that today with the various interests, the very strong, is Israeli or Jewish lobby is related to Israel.
It's worse than ever. Yeah.
And of course, in the 30s, you had that too, but biggest thing you had. British influence. Everyone talks about German Nazi or German fifth columnists. No one talks about British fifth columnists. Working in this because they were in league with the White House and the Eastern Seaboard, the Anglophile Eastern Seaboard interest and all that. So, but you had that going on, and you had to the American First Committee just simply wanted to maintain America's sovereignty and steer clear of these European wars. But if a good example is what influence the War Party had back then was they had everything they had pretty much all the communications and the media at their disposal, because even Hollywood was in league.
Correct.
If you look at movies like Gunga Din coming out in 1940-41, Sergeant York, 1941. That's no coincidence. You also had movies like Casablanca, where Rick is supposed to be the isolationist, right? The American expat who doesn't want to get involved in the fight, but inevitably he realizes, well, nope, he can't not stay out of the conflict, and he begins this beautiful relationship with the French, with the with the chief of police there at the end. This is the beginning of a beautiful relationship, and the movie ends.
Yeah.
And it's a movie against like so-called isolationism.
They hired the best, and actually one of the screenwriters for that also wrote the screenplay for Mission to Moscow, which came out during the war, which is really, I think, the most pro-communist movie perhaps that Hollywood ever produced.
Oh, yes, Joseph Davies' book.
Joseph Davies, based on his book.
Yeah. Turns out he was bribed, wasn't? Didn't he receive a bunch of money from like jewels and paintings from the Bolsheviks?
Well, I know he did very, very well for himself, and he was also very high-ranking Freemason, as was Roosevelt, and so it was a big push on to support the war effort. And it's interesting you're mentioning Sergeant York. I don't know if we touched on this before. It was released in September of '41. I think it was just a few weeks before Pearl Harbor, and this movie was about a Sergeant York, who'd been reluctant. It was a true story, basically, but he was a guy who was, for religious reasons, was reluctant to enlist in World War I.
Gary Cooper.
And he did enlist, became a hero, and now the message was, look, if it'll be like Sergeant York, we just got bombed, hey, you got to enlist, go and fight in Europe, just like Sergeant York did. Yeah. And I believe Gary Cooper won the Oscar as Best Actor for that. They're pretty good at handing out Oscars for, Gentleman's Agreement, getting the Oscar in March of 1948, and then Harry Truman recognizing Israel in May of 1948. Of course, being about the problem of anti-Semitism in America, and of course we all know about the movie Pearl Harbor coming out strategically in between PNAC calling for a new Pearl Harbor and the actual 9/11 event. The movie came out in May of 2001 to prepare America. Even though Touchstone's Pictures, to my knowledge, had never produced a war movie or a patriotic movie prior to that. Mm-hmm. So Hollywood is definitely, and I know you've done did one recently on Hollywood PSYOPs, but Hollywood definitely throughout the years has timed its movies for strategic impact on American opinion.
Yeah, I was listening to a talk about that. He said there was a movie that involved, I forget what the name of the movie was, but this is because illustration how it's done is because a lot of these movies request help from the Pentagon for use of equipment,
right,
scenery, advice, and in return for that, the Pentagon gets to rewrite the scripts. So they have the liaison office. So basically, they'll turn a movie into a propaganda thing for the Pentagon or U.S. foreign policy or something. And they've done studies like Tom Secker, who's done research in Hollywood and CIA and the Pentagon. The Pentagon's been involved in shows like Cake Wars. So it's a big PSYOP thing, and it's hard to know what their objective is. But I do think a lot of these shows are some sort of cultural programming, and so although it may not be overt, but they're involved in these shows that have nothing to do. They have nothing to do with the military, but they're involved in the production of these shows. But this one show involved a terrorist attack, and the script it was supposed to be a domestic terrorist attack. But the Pentagon said, we'll help you, but switched it to make the terrorists from this country. And it was a country that the U.S. was ready would bomb in the next 6 to 12 months.
Oh, we're always being prepped. In fact,
like what? Why is it the crazy Libyans in Back to the Future? Remember that?
Yeah, actually, as the war on terror unfolded, beginning with Reagan bombing Libya in 1986, you suddenly had all these movie psyops. It was the Libyans in Back to the Future, and there was another movie, Not Without My Daughter, about a woman trying to get her daughter out of crazy Iran. And there was Delta Force, and all these movies that were suddenly gearing us up for the new enemy. I've got an article on my website, jamesperloff.com. It's called, Did the Cold War End So That the War on Terror Could Begin? Because, Tim, maybe we've discussed this on your show. I can't remember. But I had this, when Glasnost occurred, it sent kind of shockwaves to us in the anti-communist movement. I was writing for the New American Magazine, and how come the communists, it just didn't seem like they would voluntarily give up their power, and we're trying to evaluate that. But in retrospect, as I look back on it, obviously what should have happened when the Cold War ended, what should have happened is that we should have turned our budget to domestic things. There should have been no longer a need for a big military budget. But what happened is Gorbachev came to power in 1985. Reagan bombed Gaddafi in 86 based on a false flag psyop pulled off by the Mossad. And you can read that in the book The Other Side of Deception by Viktor Ostrovsky, former Mossad agent, how Mossad planted a Trojan transmitter in Libya to make it look like Libya had bombed this American disc attack. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union broke up, and in 1991, we fought our first land war in the Middle East, the Gulf War of 91. And so you see this progression out of the Cold War into the War on Terror, but Hollywood very much bringing us along with the new enemy, the Arabs and the Muslims.
That's right, because prior to that, Arabs were kind of treated as being somewhat exotic, and all of a sudden they become demonized as the new enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Because of course you have Lawrence of Arabia, and of course that involves World War I and the intrigues of the British breaking up the Ottoman Empire and getting into the Middle East. But yeah, you have this coordination with the media, and Hollywood just is one more element to it. But if you really at the top, the corporations and the people that run Hollywood are integrated into the Council on Foreign Relations, even various actresses and actors and directors, all CFR guys, and gals. So the connections are all. This is another example of how the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a representative or agent of the powers that be, the financial interests, the corporate interests, the ruling elite. That's how they implement their agenda and how they how they influence policy, and they give the appearance again of heterodox opinion, of consensus, but it really is it's emanating from a single source to promote the narrow interests of the people that run a handful of corporations, So, but you call it you've called it a factory of U.S. foreign policy. Can you give us examples of that?
Certainly. The United Nations came out of the Council on Foreign Relations. What happened was when World War II began, their executive director, Walter Mallory, went with the editor of Foreign Affairs, Hamilton Fish Armstrong, down to Washington and met with the Assistant Secretary of State, George Messersmith, who was also a member of the CFR, and they reached an agreement that the CFR would start to help, quote unquote, the State Department formulate its wartime policy, and they produced almost 700 papers for the Roosevelt administration and began basically to take over the State Department. And it was a group of CFR members called the Informal Agenda Group that actually generated the plan for the United Nations. And the reason they called themselves Informal Agenda Group was because they had this bad memory of how the Senate had got wind of how bad the League of Nations might turn out to be, and they didn't want the Senate to interfere. And so by choosing the name Informal Agenda Group, nobody's going to look into a group that has a boring name like that. But the UN, of course, became a very significant organization. When it held its founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, 47 of the U.S. delegates were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. It was their baby the whole way. And, of course, that was successfully implemented. This time, the Senate was given very little time to debate this time around. And you and I have done a show on the Korean War, but the first regrets on joining the UN started to come in with the Korean War because Harry Truman sent troops to Korea. We had over 30,000 dead and 100,000 wounded, and he did not bother getting a declaration of war. He didn't even bother to consult the Congress because he said he was doing this in response to our UN's call for UN action, and it was a police action, and he was obliged under the treaty. So they formulated that. But another example would be the Marshall Plan, which, according to the mainstream media version, as it was thought up by General George Marshall, but students of the CFR have revealed that it was actually formulated at the Council on Foreign Relations by a study group that had David Rockefeller as its secretary. It's amazing how long this guy's been around. We're talking 1947 he was active. And the reason that Marshall was picked to present the Marshall Plan, it was originally going to be called the Truman Plan, but in their discussion, they decided that if Truman introduced it, the Republicans might oppose it and think it was a Democratic boondoggle. And so since Marshall was misperceived as being politically neutral, he was actually very much under the shadow and wing and control of the powers that be. By having a general introduce it, it could get bipartisan support, and that worked. It got bipartisan support, and the Marshall Plan had a couple of goals. One was to use taxpayer money to subsidize corporations to send these goods to Europe on the pretext that Europe was starving. And the second was to the funds were actually used to jumpstart what would ultimately become the EU. The Europeans actually had to pay for Marshall Plan goods with something called counterpart funds. It was printing press money. And the man in charge of those funds was none other than John J. McCloy. And then in 1947, Jean Monnet, who Time magazine called the father of Europe, sent his delegates to McCloy and said that they needed funds for a program for European unity. So Marshall Plan funds were actually converted into what was called the Council of Europe, and newspapers and college programs to promote European unity. All of this eventually became the common market and ultimately the EU. So without even knowing it, American taxpayer funds supported the creation of the EU. And that's what the Marshall Plan was basically about, profit and political consolidation, but sold to Americans as helping the needy and dreamed up by an American general, but actually a product of the CFR.
Because one thing I realized about this cabal, the claque of people, is they're monopolists. Mm-hmm. And they not only do they seek to monopolize their own given industry, they seek a political monopoly too, because that way they can also further extend their control. They're not just their profits, but their control of the world. That's how they get into these countries. The IMF and the World Bank are used to pry open markets of third world countries and let them get access to the resources to those countries on the cheap through the issuances of use of debt as a weapon. And that's again one method that they use to control these countries. You control the countries, control the local governments, local satrap regimes. You get in there, and you can get them to kick off, native people off their ancestral homelands, throw them into the cities, and you get the resources cheap. You can pollute without any problems, and then you also have a source of cheap labor in the cities, which then you can export the factories to these areas when the cost of labor gets too expensive here in the United States. And they call that free trade.
Amazing. You've just summarized it very well, and I should mention that the World Bank and IMF are another example of something that was generated by the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, officially, of course, they were created at the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, but all of the initial groundwork and planning was done before Bretton Woods by the War and Peace Studies Project of the CFR, which I just mentioned. They had a branch called the Economic and Finance Group, and they're the ones who dreamed up the World Bank and the IMF, and they were formally instituted at Bretton Woods. But that's another CFR project. So again, they are like a factory of American foreign policy. The irony is, Tim, that Americans didn't even know that the CFR existed. The first major article to appear about it was 1958, an article by Joseph Kraft called School for Statesmen, and I believe that was in Harper's. But there was not on, basically they were operating without any public knowledge. Of course, the main media organs like the New York Times were not going to talk about it. And eventually they'd be mentioned here or there. And now, of course, they've got a website and they're more open. But it is ironic that a group that had almost monolithic control of our foreign policy was not even, their very existence was not known to the American public.
Well, much like the NSA, right, for decades, or CIA for that matter. Of course, they came out kind of in the late 50s. People got a general idea of that. People started making movies about it, like North by Northwest and things like that. But now they have a Washington office, as Hillary Clinton was happy to say, because she said, as she said in her speech, she doesn't have to go to New York now to receive her orders, and she said that as Secretary of State.
Right. Well, I'll give the folks the exact quote
Yes.
From Hillary, and they can see this on YouTube. But she said, she's speaking at their Washington branch. They started in New York City because that's where the banks are, but eventually they decided if they wanted to control Washington, it'd be nice to have a branch down there. So here's what Hillary said, quote, "I have been often to, I guess, the mother ship in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this means I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future," unquote. Kind of a vivid admission that the council does set policy and tell our officials what to do.
Yeah, and a good example of how it gets done, business gets done, is Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, okayed about $150 billion of arms sales to various terrorist, repressive regimes around the world, and they in turn donated money to the Clinton Foundation. Yeah,
isn't it amazing how that works? And I guess there's no limit on donations to the foundation, whereas there are limits on overtly political campaign contributions.
Certainly. And of course, the World Bank is there, or the IMF is there, to make sure that the money is loaned to these governments to buy these weapons, that the taxpayers, which the taxpayers ultimately underwrite, because that's how the system is set up with these third world loans. And of course, the taxpayers underwrite the loans ultimately, and the collateral for the loans are the resources of said countries.
Yeah, they've been doing that for a long time. That's how the game works. And of course, the IMF and the World Bank are backed by the good faith of the American taxpayer. You're mentioning Hillary. My latest post is actually on Hillary, and it's actually just a collection of cartoons, memes, and funny videos about Hillary. Because sometimes I feel that humor is more effective than just writing a serious essay. But I actually feel that the establishment has picked her, at least as their favorite choice as president. And the reason I say that, Timothy, is that she's the only candidate that is viable, that seems to be 100% what the Rothschilds and the powers that be want. I mean, she's pro-gun control, she's pro-Israel, she's pro-war on terror, she's pro-Fed, she's pro-GMO, she's pro-Monsanto, she's pro-mass immigration, she's pro-population control, she's pro-internet censorship. And a couple other clues are she's gotten more money from Wall Street and Goldman Sachs than any other candidate except maybe Jeb Bush, depends on the analyst tallying up the numbers. And also, she was made Secretary of State. It seems like the probable main purpose of that was to give her a credential, or one of the main purposes was to give her a credential to run for the White House with. Also, after she was Secretary of State, CBS came out with a show called Madam Secretary, which is promoting her and profiling her in a positive way every week to millions of viewers. And the other reason I think that they're backing Hillary, Tim, is that they already trusted her for 2 terms in the White House behind Bill. And of course, Bill will be going right back in the White House if we elect her. So I think their money's on Hillary. I think that they wouldn't mind having a socialist in there, but Bernie Sanders is too anti-banker and Trump is too anti-immigration, and he says he's pro-Second Amendment. So I don't think they would allow either one. And so I think that the powers that be have her lined up. But of course, there are problems. But we saw already that they had no trouble sweeping Bill Clinton's scandals under the carpet. So I think that they may be planning to do the same with Hillary's, with her emailing, et cetera.
Well, she clearly violated her security agreements and oaths when she had her aides, cut off the classification on those emails, and she put them on her server. It's a clear violation of security, and anyone lower down the rung would have already been indicted, if not convicted, for that. So,
well, I remember when Bill Clinton was president, he had, as you know, he had many scandals. There was not only the women, but there was Whitewater, and there was perjury, and there were reports of overseeing drug deals when he was governor of Arkansas, and murder connections, and Travelgate and Chinagate. And, every time one of those scandals came up, in conservative media, they said, this is it. He's going to be impeached. And you know what, Tim? 2 weeks later, it would all be forgotten about, and it would be back to business as usual. So I'm afraid that because we've got that pattern established for the Clintons, that the same thing is going to happen here, that so much power is going to be wielded on her behalf that they're going to just show us they can get anyone elected no matter what.
Yes.
But I'm not sure of that, but that's just how I feel it's trending.
Mm-hmm. Now, so basically we've demonstrated that all the major policy decisions that were taken all originated out of the CFR, pretty much the post-war era, the institutions, all our CFR ideas. And, of course, I think the Department of Homeland Security was a idea that was spawned by a committee that was, I think, populated by members of the CFR, correct? And that was before 9/11, right?
That's correct. In fact, let me just grab that information for you. It was a committee that had 12 members, 9 of whom were in the CFR. And, goodness, I'm going to have trouble finding that exact reference. So good my index is here. I know it.
But the interesting point is this was I think that the idea was submitted before the events of 9/11.
Okay, here it is. It was the United States Commission on National Security proposed a National Homeland Security Agency in 1998, and National Homeland Security Agency is the very phrase President Bush used 3 years later after 9/11. So that was 9 out of 12 were CFR members on that. Remember, the CFR has less than 5,000 members, and when Kennedy was president, they only had about 900. So yet they've managed to dominate. I should mention the dominance. We haven't mentioned the numbers yet. But to sum up the current tally, 19 secretaries of state have been members of the CFR, 21 secretaries of the Treasury, 23 defense secretaries, which includes the older War Department, and 16 CIA directors. And I'd like to just stop there and mention why they concentrate on particularly dominating these departments. Obviously, they want the Treasury Department because they want to control the flow of money. They want the Defense Department because they want to be able to control the wars. They want the State Department because it's our foreign policy that generates those wars usually. And, of course, they want the CIA to control intelligence, both foreign and domestic. So they're particularly focused, but broadly they dominate cabinet. So if you look at the current cabinet of Obama, Secretary of State John Kerry is a member. Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew is a CFR member, as was his predecessor, Timothy Geithner. Ashton Carter, the current Secretary of Defense, is a member. His predecessor, Chuck Hagel, and his predecessor, Robert Gates, all working for Obama, were all CFR. The Director of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, is CFR, as was his predecessor, Napolitano. Over at Commerce, Penny Pritzker is a member. At Energy, Ernest Moniz is a member, and Joe Biden's a member. And you go back through time, you go back to Bush, Cheney was a member, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz. Bill Clinton had 12 CFR members in his cabinet. So they dominate through time. And this is, again, one of the reasons why you see only minor changes. When, Obama became president, a lot of believing Democrats thought he was going to end the wars in the Middle East. In fact, he had promised during his campaign that his first day in office, he would order the troops home from Afghanistan. And, years and years later, they're still there, right? But one reason why we have so little change is because you're electing the same guys. They just take off the Republican stick pins from their label and put on a Democrat stick pin. But it's the same CFR controlling our policy. President Kennedy once complained about this. He said, "Why don't I ever see any new faces?" when somebody handed him a list of State Department personnel to pick.
Yeah, he eventually got the message, didn't he?
As some would say, yes.
Yeah. I think he was invited to the CFR, but never showed, from what I understand.
Well, interestingly enough, his name never appeared on the roster of the Council on Foreign Relations, but he did write a letter stating that he was a member. and I don't know what the reason for that is. It may have been a mistake, or perhaps he was a silent member that was not on their rolls. I don't know the reason. He said he was a member, but he never was listed officially.
So we're looking at basically the CFR again. It is a it's been called I would call one of these imperial brain trusts that do the work of the ruling elite, the corporations, the banksters that run the world. And with the veneer of some sort of disinterested or less independent think tank. But basically it represents, for lack of a term, Wall Street, the banks, the moneyed interests, so they can go on exploiting the world. And if you look at something like the CIA and how it grew out of this financial elite itself, I think when it was formed, the committee that was formed to write the draft proposal for the CIA was full of a bunch of Wall Street bankers and bond salesmen. So, people like Robert Levitt, Alan Dulles himself, and his brother John Foster Dulles were both CFR members, and they both worked for the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, which did the bidding for U.S. multinational corporations. And in fact, they're the best example. Those two are the best examples, you get illustration or embodiment of this sort of this corporatist fascist system we live under.
Right. Alan Dulles was in fact the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and his brother John Foster Dulles was a founding member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he actually contributed an article to the very first issue of Foreign Affairs in 1922. He also helped draft the UN Charter. You're talking about a globalist extraordinaire.
Mm-hmm. Because he was at Versailles.
He was at Versailles as, I believe, legal counsel to the American delegation, along with Paul Warburg, the founder of the Fed, was there, and Bernard Baruch, who made over $100 million in profits off World War I. They were all there surrounding Woodrow Wilson.
Mm-hmm. And in the Dulles brothers themselves, because they went on to dominate U.S. foreign policy in the immediate post-war era. Throughout the 50s. And of course, it was Alan Dulles, who was immediately sacked by JFK after the Bay of Pigs debacle. And of course, he oversees the investigation of JFK's assassination. So,
he was on that team along with John J. McCloy.
So, I mean, what we're looking at here is an oligarchy. And I don't think America's descent into oligarchism or becoming an oligarchy has been a gradual thing. I guess you could say the money interests have always existed from the get-go, but they really seem to consolidate their power in the late 19th, early 20th century. This probably has something to do with the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, America as the federal government consolidating its power over the country. Mm-hmm. But lately there was a study out of Princeton. Was it Princeton University? It said, the United States is an oligarchy. And he says, America is no longer a democracy. Never mind the democratic republic envisioned by the founding fathers. Rather, it has taken a turn down elitist lane and become a country led by a small dominant class comprised of powerful members who exert total control over the general population. An oligarchy, said a new study jointly conducted by Princeton and Northwestern universities.
How do you like that? Princeton actually affirms what the truth movement's been saying for over a decade, long over a decade, depending on your view of what the truth movement is. But more and more of us, ever since 9/11, of course, have been waking up to that fact. But to beat Princeton to the punch, let me give you a quote that I probably gave on this show before. It's one of my favorites. This is from 1937. Quote, the United States is owned and dominated today by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families. These families are the living center of the modern oligarchy, which dominates the United States, functioning under a democratic form of government behind which a de facto government, absolutist and plutocratic, has taken form. This de facto government actually is the government of the United States, invisible, shadowy. It's the government of money and a dollar democracy.